On the night of April 9th, 1974, Johnny Carson was standing in the wings of his own show when a 15-year-old boy walked past him carrying a small wooden box. Not a prop, not a gift for the cameras, a box that had been wrapped in brown paper and sealed with tape so old it had yellowed at the edges. The boy held it like it weighed something that had nothing to do with wood and nothing to do with weight. He held it the way you hold something you are terrified of losing and equally terrified of keeping. Johnny had been hosting The Tonight Show for 12 years. He had stood in those same wings with Frank Sinatra, with Bob Hope, with the President of the United States. He had seen nervous guests, shaking guests, guests who arrived drunk, and guests who arrived weeping. He had never seen a 15-year-old look like this. He had never seen a child carry something like that. He stepped forward and said one word, just one, "Hey." And the boy stopped and turned and looked at Johnny Carson with eyes that were too old for his face and too sad for a night that was supposed to be a celebration. And then Michael Jackson said something so quiet that Johnny had to lean down to hear it. What he heard would stay with him for the rest of his life. Not because it was shocking, not because it was scandalous, but because no child should ever have to say something like that to a stranger in a television hallway. And because what was inside that box, what Michael finally placed in Johnny's hands 40 minutes later in front of 22 million Americans, would reveal a truth about the price of childhood fame that nobody in Hollywood had been willing to say out loud. But before starting our video, I'd like to say something. I often see comments from people who did not realize they were not subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.
The world before that night. To understand what happened on that April night, you need to understand what the Jackson 5 had already been through by the time they walked onto the Tonight Show stage. Because by 1974, the five brothers from Gary, Indiana, had already lived 3 lifetimes worth of experience inside 1 decade. Gary, Indiana, in the 1960s, was not a place where dreams came easy. It was a steel town, industrial and unforgiving, the kind of place where fathers worked themselves hollow at the mill and mothers stretched every dollar until it bled. Joseph Jackson, the father of the 5 boys, was a guitarist who had never made it. He was a man who understood exactly what talent looked like, and exactly what the world would do to talent if nobody fought for it. Some people would later call the way he raised his sons hard. Some would call it something worse. But in the early years, what it produced was undeniable. Those 5 boys could sing together in a way that made people stop moving, that made strangers stand completely still in the middle of a fair or a talent show or a smoky nightclub and just listen, because something in the air changed when they started. Tito on guitar, Jermaine on bass, Jackie leading, Marlon holding the harmonies, and in the center of all of it, the smallest one, Michael. 9 years old and already the kind of performer you did not explain. You just pointed and said, "Look at that." By 1969, Motown had signed them, and by 1970, the whole country knew their name. I Want You Back was not just a hit. It was a detonation. It rewrote what people thought a child could do on a stage. It rewrote what people thought soul music could sound like, coming from a child's mouth. 3 more number ones followed inside 12 months. The Jackson 5 were not famous. Famous was too small a word. They were a phenomenon. And at the center of that phenomenon, doing the spins, hitting the notes nobody else could reach, carrying the weight of the whole machinery of it, was Michael, 11 years old, 12, 13, growing up inside a spotlight so bright it left no shadows anywhere, no place to hide, no room to be ordinary, no permission to be confused or scared or just a kid who wanted a Saturday afternoon with nothing to do. By 1974, Michael was 15, and the Jackson 5 had released a string of albums, toured America twice, toured the world once, and generated a level of revenue that would make grown men in suits argue behind closed doors about who owned what and what the future looked like, and whether a 15-year-old boy had any say in any of it. He did not, and he knew it. But what nobody outside that family knew was what Michael had been carrying since the very beginning. A secret he had written down once, only once, on a single piece of paper. A piece of paper he had folded and placed inside a small wooden box that had belonged to his grandmother. A box he had carried with him on every tour bus, on every airplane, into every arena and television studio and hotel room for 3 years, waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right place to finally put it down. But what happened next showed that he almost didn't make it to that moment at all. The day of the taping. April 9th, 1974. NBC Studios, Burbank, California. The taping was scheduled for 5:30 in the evening, and the Jackson family arrived at 3, all 5 brothers, their father Joseph, their road manager, 2 publicists from Motown who smiled at everything and said very little. The production staff at The Tonight Show had seen big guests before, but there was something different about the energy that arrived with the Jacksons. It was not arrogance. It was not the brittle nervousness of celebrities afraid of being shown up. It was something more complicated and harder to name. It was the energy of people who had learned to move through the world as a unit, as a machine, as something that functioned and performed and delivered, and who had perhaps forgotten, or perhaps never been allowed, to do anything else. The stage manager, a veteran of 12 years on the show, named Carl Beckett, later told a colleague that when the 5 brothers walked past him in the corridor, he noticed something he could not explain immediately. 4 of them were talking, laughing, punching each other in the shoulder the way brothers do. Normal, young, alive. But the 5th one, the smallest one, was walking slightly behind the rest. Not lost, not sulking, just separate in a way that felt deliberate, like he was watching the other 4 from a place they could not quite reach. Carl said later that he thought the boy looked like someone who was trying to decide something, not what to sing or how to move or what to say to Johnny Carson when the cameras rolled. Something bigger than that. Something that had been sitting on the edge of a decision for a long time and was finally running out of road. In the green room, the brothers settled in. Jermaine leaned back and closed his eyes. Jackie pulled out a deck of cards. Marlon and Tito argued about something technical, some note in one of the songs, voices low and fast the way musicians argue, the argument that is also a rehearsal. And Michael sat in the corner of the room with the wooden box on his knees and did not speak to anyone for 45 minutes. One of the Motown publicists noticed the box and asked what it was. Michael looked up at her with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "Just something I'm carrying," he said. She looked at Joseph. Joseph looked at the box. Something passed between them that was not quite anger, and not quite fear, and not quite anything you could put a clean name on. He didn't ask about it again. Neither did she. At 4:45, Johnny Carson came to the green room to say hello before the taping. This was not standard procedure. Johnny was not a glad-hander. He did not make pre-show rounds to settle nerves or build rapport. He generally arrived, prepared, taped, and that was that. But something about tonight had pulled him out of his dressing room early. He would say later that he didn't know why. He just felt like he should. He knocked on the green room door and pushed it open, and the first person he saw, sitting right there at the edge of the nearest couch with that wooden box in his lap, was Michael Jackson. And the look on Michael's face when their eyes met was not the look of a fan meeting a hero. It was the look of someone who had been waiting. Johnny said, "Hey," just that. And Michael stood up and they stepped out into the corridor together. And that is where the conversation happened that nobody else heard. The conversation that changed what happened on that stage an hour later. The conversation in the corridor. What Michael Jackson said to Johnny Carson in that corridor has never been published in a book or confirmed in an interview. But 3 people who were within earshot of that hallway that evening: a lighting technician named Gary Pruitt, an NBC page named Sandra Hollis, and a makeup artist whose name has never been publicly attached to the story. All described the same thing independently in the years that followed: a tall man crouching slightly to be at eye level with a small teenager, a low, urgent voice coming from the boy, a long silence from the man, and then the man reaching out and placing one hand gently on top of the wooden box the boy was still holding against his chest. Sandra Hollis said later that she did not hear the words, but she heard the tone, and the tone was unlike anything she had heard in 12 years of working at NBC. She said it sounded like a confession. She said it sounded like the first time someone had been allowed to say something true. What is known, what can be assembled from the threads left behind, is this. Michael told Johnny about the box, not what was inside it yet, but what it meant. He told him about his grandmother Catherine, who had given him the box when he was 9 years old, and told him to put his most important truth inside it and carry it until he found the right moment to let it go. He told Johnny that he had been carrying it for 3 years. He told him that he had written something down on a single piece of paper that he had never shown anyone, not his mother, not his brothers, not anyone in the machinery of the Motown empire that had swallowed his childhood whole. And he told Johnny that tonight, for reasons he could not fully explain, felt like the night. Johnny Carson was 48 years old. He had 2 failed marriages behind him, and a third that was beginning to fray at the edges. He had spent 22 years performing a version of himself that the whole country loved, and a very small number of people actually knew. He understood, in a way that very few people in that building could have understood, exactly what Michael was describing: the weight of a public face, the loneliness behind it, the thing you carry that you cannot show, because showing it would break the image, and the image is the only thing the industry sees when it looks at you. He looked at the box. He looked at the boy. And then Johnny Carson said something that Gary Pruitt, standing 15 feet away pretending to check a circuit panel, heard clearly enough to remember word for word 30 years later. He said, "If you want to tell the truth on that stage tonight, I will not let them cut to commercial. You have my word." Michael looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Then he walked back into the green room and sat back down with the box in his lap. And Johnny Carson walked back toward his dressing room and stood in front of his mirror for a full minute without moving. He was thinking about something. What he was thinking about, nobody knows. But his makeup artist said that when she came in to touch up his foundation 10 minutes later, his eyes looked different than usual. She said he looked like a man who had just remembered something important he had been trying to forget. The taping begins. The taping began at 5:30. Exactly. The Tonight Show ran like a machine in those years, precise and professional. Each segment timed to the second. Each commercial break a small act of engineering. Doc Severinson's band opened with the theme, and the audience of 312 people inside Studio One responded the way Tonight Show audiences always responded: warmly, eagerly, the way people respond to something familiar that they love. Johnny's monologue was crisp that night. Watergate jokes, which were unavoidable in April of 1974 and always reliable. A bit about the gas shortage. A golf joke. The audience laughed in exactly the right places, and Johnny moved through it with the fluency of a man who had done this 10,000 times. But Ed McMahon noticed something. He mentioned it years later in a conversation that was recorded, but never formally published. He said Johnny kept glancing toward the wings during the monologue, not nervously, not anxiously, but with a quality of attention that was different from his usual precision, like he was keeping track of something, like he was waiting. The first guest that night was a comedian whose name is less important to this story than what happened when he left the stage, and Ed McMahon leaned over to Johnny during the commercial break and asked, quietly, behind the noise of the band warming up, whether everything was all right. Johnny looked at him. There was a pause of several seconds, which in their relationship, a relationship built on rapid professional shorthand, and the comfortable silence of men who had worked side by side for years, was significant. Then Johnny said something that Ed would think about for a long time afterward. He said, "Ed, tonight might be one of those nights we remember." Ed McMahon asked what he meant. Johnny just shook his head and turned back toward the stage as the floor director counted them down from commercial. And then Ed McMahon's voice filled the studio, the voice that had introduced 1,000 guests on 1,000 nights. But tonight carried a different weight underneath the words. Ladies and gentlemen, the biggest pop group in America, the young men who have been making the whole country move since 1969. Please welcome to The Tonight Show for the very first time, the Jackson 5. The audience erupted. 312 people on their feet before the first note played. Doc Severinson's band launched into I Want You Back, and the five brothers walked out from behind the curtain, and the energy in that studio changed in the way it only changes when something genuinely electric enters a room. 4 of them were grinning, soaking it in, feeding the crowd back its own excitement. Michael walked out last. He was smiling too. Of course he was. He knew how to smile on a stage. He had been doing it since he was 8 years old. But he was also holding something under his jacket with his left arm pressed close to his body, and anyone who was watching closely enough would have noticed that his right hand moved differently during the song that followed, slightly less free than his brother's, slightly more contained, as if one part of him was already somewhere else entirely, already in the conversation that was coming. And nobody was watching closely enough, except Johnny Carson. The performance and the shift. They performed 2 songs before the interview portion of the segment. The production team had cleared 12 minutes for performance and 10 minutes for conversation, and everyone in the control room was watching the clock the way they always did. Because The Tonight Show did not run long, The Tonight Show did not deviate. The Tonight Show was a machine that respected time above almost everything else. The performances were extraordinary. That is not sentiment. That is not nostalgia. People who were in that studio that night said the same thing consistently in the years afterward. They said the 5 brothers performed with a tightness and a joy and a physical precision that made the whole room feel like it was vibrating. They said the audience was not just applauding. They were up. They were moving. 312 people who had come to a television taping on a Tuesday evening in Burbank were suddenly in a concert, in a revival, in something that made them forget where they were. And at the center of it, Michael, moving in ways that did not seem possible for a 15-year-old body, spinning and stopping and hitting a note so clean it seemed to cut the air, and then spinning again. The audience screaming, the band driving harder, 4 brothers locked in the groove behind him, and Michael at the front of all of it, giving the crowd everything it wanted, giving the crowd everything it had always been given. And then the last note faded, and Doc Severinson's band landed the final chord, and 312 people made a sound like a wave breaking. Johnny Carson stood and applauded, which he did not always do. He waited for the sound to crest and settle, and then he gestured for the brothers to come sit. 4 of them crossed to the guest chairs, easy and comfortable, still buzzing from the performance. Michael came last. He was carrying the box. He had brought it out from wherever he had kept it during the songs. He set it on his knee as he sat down, and placed both hands flat on top of it, and looked at Johnny. Johnny looked back, and something passed between them that the cameras caught, but nobody watching at home that night understood. Not yet. The first few minutes of the interview were what you would expect. Johnny asked about the tour, asked about the new album, asked the brothers about growing up in Gary, Indiana, about what their mother cooked for them, about whether they ever got sick of each other on the tour bus. The brothers answered with the practiced warmth of people who had done many interviews, who had learned to be entertaining and charming, and just personal enough to feel real, without giving anything actually real away. Jermaine was smooth. Jackie was warm. Marlon made the audience laugh. Tito said something quietly genuine about missing home. And Michael answered every question clearly and politely, and with a smile, and added almost nothing that surprised anyone. Until Johnny leaned back in his chair and looked at the box on Michael's knee, and said, in a voice that was casual but not accidental, "So, Michael, you brought something with you tonight. Tell me about that." The studio went quiet so fast it was like someone had turned a dial. The box. Michael Jackson looked down at the box. Then he looked at his brothers. Jackie gave a small frown, the unconscious, protective frown of an older brother who does not know what is coming, but can feel that something is. Joseph Jackson was sitting in the audience, third row, end of the aisle, and people who were near him said his jaw tightened when Johnny asked about the box, though he said nothing and did not move. The Motown publicist in the wings later said she reached instinctively for her clipboard, which was her habit when something was happening that she was not sure could be managed. Michael looked back at Johnny, and Johnny nodded once. Just that. The same nod he had given in the corridor, the small private signal between two people who had made a private arrangement. And Michael Jackson, 15 years old, took both hands off the top of the box, unlatched it, and opened it. Inside, sitting on a small square of dark fabric, was a single folded piece of paper. Michael did not unfold it yet. He looked at it for a moment. The studio was completely silent, 312 people holding very still, 22 million Americans watching from their living rooms at home who did not know yet what they were watching, but could feel in the quality of the silence that it was something. Johnny said nothing. He waited. Michael lifted the paper from the box. He unfolded it slowly, carefully, the way you unfold something that is fragile, not because the paper is fragile, but because what is written on it is. And then he looked up at Johnny and said something that none of the production staff had anticipated, and that the control room later confirmed had not been mentioned in any pre-interview briefing. He said, "My grandmother gave me this box when I was 9 years old. She told me the truth is the only thing worth keeping. She said, carry it until you find someone who will hear it. I have been carrying it for 3 years." He paused. He looked out at the audience, 312 strangers sitting absolutely still. He looked back at Johnny. He said, "I want to read you what I wrote down." Nobody in that studio breathed. The truth. The paper had been folded 4 times. Michael smoothed it once against his knee, and then he read, in a voice that was quiet and steady, the voice of a 15-year-old who had decided to be precise because precision was the only protection left. He said, "I wrote this when I was 12 years old. I wrote it because I needed to say it somewhere, and there was nowhere to say it. I wrote, I love what I do when I am doing it. I love the music, and I love the stage, and I love it when the crowd feels something because of what we played. That part is real. But I do not know who I am when the music stops. I do not know how to be a person who is not performing. I have been performing since I was 5 years old. I do not know what I am outside of this, and I am scared that if I ever stop, I will find out there is nothing there. That it is only the performance. That the performance is all there is." He refolded the paper. He placed it back in the box. He closed the latch. The studio was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system. You could hear someone in the 3rd row drawing a slow breath. Johnny Carson sat very still. His hands, which had held note cards and prop telephones and joke setups for 22 years of live television, were motionless on the desk. He looked at Michael for a long time. And then he did something that his producer, Fred de Cordova, later described as the most unexpected thing he had seen in 12 years of running The Tonight Show. Johnny pushed the note cards to the side of his desk. He leaned forward, and he told a story that he had never told on television before. He told about the night in 1962 when he had sat alone in his apartment the week after taking over The Tonight Show, absolutely certain that he was a fraud, absolutely certain that the audience would eventually see through the performance and find nothing underneath it worth watching. He said he had sat there for 2 hours thinking the same thought that Michael had written down, that the performance might be all there was, that the self who existed outside the spotlight might be so underdeveloped, so unused, so unfed, as to be barely real. He said that he had never told anyone that. Not in 12 years. Not his wife. Not Ed McMahon. Nobody. And he said that he was telling it now because a 15-year-old boy had just stood up in front of 22 million people and said the most honest thing that had ever been said on his stage. The audience did not applaud. Not yet. They sat in the particular silence of people who have heard something true and are holding it carefully. What happened next? What followed was 17 minutes that the Tonight Show control room had not planned for and did not cut away from. Johnny had given his word in the corridor, and he kept it. Fred de Cordova, watching from the booth, later wrote in his unpublished production notes that he considered going to commercial twice, and stopped himself both times because, as he put it, the air in the room felt sacred, and he did not want to be the man who broke it. Michael's brothers sat quietly through most of what followed. Jackie, at one point, leaned forward and put his hand briefly on Michael's shoulder, the gesture of a brother who does not have the words, but has the instinct to reach. Jermaine looked at the floor. Marlon looked at Michael. Tito sat very still in the way that the quietest people in a family sit when something important is finally being said that they have felt for years without the language for it. Johnny asked Michael gentle questions, not journalists' questions, not the questions of a host trying to generate content, the questions of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. He asked what it felt like to grow up on a stage. Michael said it felt like growing up inside a painting, that everyone could see you from outside, but you could not quite see yourself, because the painting was always being looked at, and never just existing. He asked whether Michael had anyone he could talk to about the things he had written on that paper. Michael looked at the box in his lap. He said he had his grandmother, but she had died the previous year. He said he had his mother, but his mother carried so much weight already that adding to it felt wrong. He said he had his brothers, and he loved his brothers. But the thing he had written down was something none of them had said out loud, and he was not sure whether they felt it too, or whether it was his alone to carry. Then he looked at Johnny and said something that stopped the room again. He said, "I think the reason I kept the box for 3 years without opening it is because I was waiting to find out whether the feeling went away, whether I would grow up and the music would give me a self, a real one, not just a performance." He paused. He put one hand back on top of the closed box. He said, "I am still waiting." Johnny looked at him for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I am 48 years old. I have been waiting for the same thing for 30 years. The difference is that you are brave enough to say it out loud at 15. And that is going to change something for you that it took me a very long time to even find words for. What do you want to do with the box now?" Michael looked at it. He looked at Johnny, and then he held it out across the desk and said, "I want you to have it. I do not want to carry it anymore." The gift. Johnny Carson took the box. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you understand the weight of. Then he looked up at the audience. 312 people who had come to watch a pop group, and had ended up inside something completely different. He said, "I am going to keep this, and I am going to tell you why." He set the box carefully on his desk, not to the side, not on a shelf, squarely in front of him where he could see it. He said, "Every person in this room tonight has a box like this, every single one of you. Maybe you have not built it out of wood. Maybe you have not written your truth down on paper and folded it up and latched the lid, but you are carrying it. You have been carrying it for years. The thing you feel when the performance stops, the thing you are afraid would be there if the noise went away, the fear that the self you show the world is all there is, and underneath it is nothing remarkable, nothing worth the attention it has been given." He looked at Michael. He said, "This young man just did something on this stage that I was not able to do in 12 years of this show. He named the fear, out loud, in front of everyone, and I want you to understand what that takes. Because naming the fear is not the same as the fear going away. It is not a cure. It is something harder than a cure. It is honesty in a world that rewards performance. It is truth in an industry built on image. It is a 15-year-old boy deciding that his grandmother was right, that the truth is the only thing worth keeping." The audience was on its feet before he finished the sentence, not the electric performance applause of an hour earlier. Something different, the sound of people recognizing something, the sound of an audience that has been given permission to remember something about themselves that they had also been quietly carrying and quietly not saying. Michael Jackson sat in his chair, with the empty space where the box had been on his knee, and his hands folded together and his eyes bright, and his posture different, not diminished, but lighter. The specific lightness of someone who has put down a weight they had convinced themselves was just part of how things felt. Johnny held the box for the rest of the segment. He did not put it down. And when the taping finally ended, when the cameras went dark and the floor crew began moving equipment and the audience filtered out into the Burbank evening, Johnny did not set the box on the desk or hand it to a prop assistant or leave it behind, the way guests left scarves and sunglasses and forgotten pages of notes. He put it under his arm. He carried it to his dressing room. He carried it home. What happened after? The Jackson 5 Tonight Show appearance aired to 22 million viewers and was received as a major television event, which it was. Critics wrote about the performance, about the brothers' chemistry, about Michael's jaw-dropping stage presence. The music press covered it. The entertainment press covered it. But almost none of the coverage mentioned what happened after the performance. Almost none of it mentioned the box, the corridor conversation, the 17 unplanned minutes, or what Michael had read from that folded piece of paper. That absence is itself a kind of story. The entertainment press in 1974 was not built for the kind of truth Michael told that night. It was built for image management and promotional coverage and the smooth machinery of celebrity. What Michael gave Johnny on that stage did not fit inside that machinery. It was too honest, too young, too unprotected. The Motown publicists, to their credit, did not try to suppress it either. They simply had no framework for it. They filed it alongside the performance reviews and moved on to the next city on the tour schedule. Joseph Jackson said nothing about it publicly. In the years that followed, when interviewers occasionally brought up the Tonight Show appearance, the conversation almost always returned immediately to the performance, to the music, to I Want You Back and the crowd on its feet. The box was mentioned in exactly 3 published interviews over the following decade. In each case, the subject was changed within a sentence or two. It was easier to talk about the music. The music was easier to hold. But inside the Tonight Show production offices, the episode became something of a legend. Fred de Cordova kept his handwritten production notes from that night, and decades later, when he was clearing out his files, he showed them to a journalist who asked him about his most memorable tapings. He said that night was at the top of the list. Not because of the Jackson 5, not because of the performance, because of what a 15-year-old boy had been brave enough to say, and because of what a 48-year-old man had been brave enough to say back. And because in 12 years of producing The Tonight Show, he had never seen anyone put a box on that desk and mean it the way Michael meant it. Johnny Carson kept the box in his dressing room at NBC for the remaining 18 years of his tenure on The Tonight Show. People who worked on the production during those years all knew it was there. None of them ever opened it. It was not their truth to open. When Johnny retired in May of 1992 and taped his final episode, one of the last things he carried out of Studio One was the box, small and wooden and worn at the corners from nearly 2 decades of sitting on a shelf in a room full of more famous things. His assistant later said that he held it very carefully on the ride home, like it still had weight, like some things you receive you carry for the rest of your life, not because you have to, but because putting them down would be a kind of betrayal of the person who trusted you enough to let them go. The moment Johnny Carson understood. Here is what that April night in 1974 was really about. It was not about the Jackson 5, though the Jackson 5 were extraordinary. It was not about celebrity or talent or the particular magic of 5 brothers from Gary, Indiana, who had rewired what pop music could be. It was about a 15-year-old boy who had been performing since before he could fully read, who had been given the world's applause in exchange for his privacy, his ordinariness, his right to grow up inside himself instead of inside a spotlight, and who had carried the cost of that exchange quietly and alone for years, until one evening in a television corridor he found a man who understood. It was about Johnny Carson, who had been performing his own version of the same bargain for 22 years, who had given America a version of himself, so polished and precise and reliably funny, that the real version, the uncertain version, the version that sat alone in his apartment in 1962 and wondered whether the performance was all there was, had almost disappeared entirely. And it was about a small wooden box and a folded piece of paper, and a grandmother who was right about the only thing that matters. The truth is the only thing worth keeping, not the performance, not the image, not the version of yourself that the world rewards, the thing you feel when the music stops, the question you have been carrying, the fear you have not named yet. If you are reading this from somewhere in the world, if you have made it to the end of this story, I want to ask you something. What is in your box? What have you been carrying that you have not said out loud? What is the thing you wrote down once, and folded up and latched and promised yourself you would put down when you found the right person, the right moment, the right room? Because here is what Michael Jackson understood at 15 years old. The room never announces itself. The moment does not arrive with a sign. You have to decide to make it the moment. You have to decide to open the box. Go home tonight and call someone you trust, not to perform for them, not to show them the version of yourself that functions and delivers and keeps moving, to tell them the real thing, the thing underneath. Because somewhere in this world there is a person who needs to hear that someone else is carrying the same box, who needs to know that the fear of finding nothing underneath the performance is not theirs alone, who needs a 15-year-old boy they never met to say out loud what they have been too afraid to whisper. Be that voice for someone tonight. Put down the box. Tell the truth. Your grandmother was right. Smash that subscribe button, because every week we bring you stories like this one. Real stories about the moments when famous people said the most human things, when the performance stopped and the truth walked in and changed the room forever. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from. Tell me what this story made you think about. Tell me what is in your box. I read every single one. and share this video with someone who is carrying something alone right now. Someone who needs to know that two strangers in a television corridor, one 48 and one 15, once made a quiet agreement that the truth was worth saying, and that the world did not end when they said it. It got a little lighter. It always does.